Welcome to the webcast. We'll be starting at the top of the hour. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Zero to Hero in Managing Enterprise Cloud Security, with SANS Certified Instructor Jason Lamb and SANS Associate Instructor Lysandra Capella. My name is Laura Dawson, and I will be moderating today's webcast. If you have any questions for the presenters during the webcast, please enter them into the Q&A feature at any time. Please note that our webcast is being recorded and will be available for viewing later on the SANS webcast registration page, as well as in your SANS account under My Webcast. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jason and Lysandra.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We've got really exciting topic here that we want to share with all of you. The title of the presentation is Zero to Hero in Managing Enterprise Cloud Security. And as the name implies, we're going to be talking about how you can manage that in your organization and then, adopting some of these best practices in your organization to, further mature your own cloud security program. Before we start, I'd like to give you a quick intro of myself, and I'll pass it over to Lysandra as well. My name is Jason Lamb, and I teach at SANS, for particularly in the cloud and also management curriculum. I have developed multiple courses for SANS over the years. This is probably over my 20th year around SANS at this point. And these days you'll find me teaching the Defending Web App and also a course within the management curriculum that is leading and the cloud implementation. And when I'm not doing the SANS work, I spend time at a really large financial organization that is global in nature, managing many different aspects of security in the organization. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lysandra to introduce herself as well.
Hey, thank you, Jason. So as Jason just mentioned, my name is Lysandra Capella. I work for a financial institution in the Dutch Caribbean. I have been working with SANS since about 2016. I TA for for different classes, and I'm particularly interested in cloud security and also working with different security areas in the financial institution that I work for. So with that, I'm handing it back to Jason.
Yep, thanks, Lysandra. And Lysandra is, if you've taken any SANS courses, you may have seen her, helping us to TA, and you may have even asked her questions in the past as well. So, yep, definitely a key individual that, you may have run into in the SANS courses. So with that, let's get started here with our topic. When we talk about cloud maturity in security and, how do you actually improve things, let's take a look at what typical organizations' cloud journey would be like. I mean, I think this slide really honed it in to say, hey, before you start migrating to the cloud, hey, by the way, if you're one of those organizations that actually started out in the cloud, great for you, right? Like, your journey is a little bit smoother, right? You have a great latitude to select your destiny. But then, a lot of organizations may not have that much luxury, right? You would have to actually go into the journey right from, hey, we have most of the things on-prem, moving, migrating, creating different disposition strategy for each of the workload to figure out, hey, does this one go first wave? Does that one go, second wave, and so on and so forth. And you got to build the foundation to be ready in the cloud. And then you can get going on some of the migration, planning out for the operations, and also the continuous optimization, continuous improvement. These are the general journey that a lot of organizations go through, right? And I'm obviously, stating the obvious here, but I also want to extend that to the fact that it's not just, okay, we do this in large enterprise particularly, right? Like even medium size as well. You have a lot of different stakeholders managing different aspects of it, right? Like, we'll talk about later on, like cost seems to be, one thing that a lot of organizations neglect or forget, and conveniently is going to come back, creep back up, and actually bother us very, very quickly, right? Like if we're not managing it. So there are a lot of aspects within cloud security that organizations would need to deal with and pay a lot of attention to. Otherwise, each of these cloud security aspects are going to creep back up to us. So knowing all those things, and you can tell from me and Lissandra, we're all in the financial, highly regulated industries, looking back at, hey, what does the journey look like? And talking to different, students, contacts in the industry, we have come up with something that may be able to help all the organizations out there. Now, we often get into the conversation, like particularly when I'm teaching my cloud security course in the management area, right? Like people ask me the questions of, hey, how secure is my cloud environment, right? Like, and also what does good or secure state looks like, because everybody understand, hey, what is like the cloud configuration management? How do I manage my virtual machine? There are many, many different aspects of questions that would pop up. So over time, we definitely have consolidated a lot of the questions, but the thematic or the themes of the questions that comes up are mostly related to, hey, how secure is my organization's cloud environment? Because a lot of people are like, hey, what does good look like, right? And, if there is a way to measure it, I'd like to know, right? And how do I plan for the next steps? Like, obviously everybody wants to do a good job in securing their organization. I've never quite heard any major organizations that no, we want to be insecure, right? Like, people want to prevent going to jail and prevent the difficult conversation of talking to the regulators after the breach, right? So, everybody want to be secure. The question is, how does it look like? Or what does it look like? And how do you actually improve your environment so that you become better, right? And what is the measuring stick on that? And given all that dynamics, Lysandra and I, right, have pieced together a cloud security maturity model. And we made it free, right? Just like a lot of the other SANS resources. We want to get this resource out there to benefit organizations so that everybody can use it. And, by the way, we welcome any feedback, right? We're not claiming that this is perfect. With a lot of different things, cloud, right, itself is really, really improving a lot, right? You look at, AWS a few years ago to now, right? The improvement is drastic. And we believe that, if we come up with a model like this, it will have to evolve very quickly as well. So we welcome any feedback. Hey, anybody can help us, we welcome that. Definitely, hit me up or Lysandra up, and we welcome any help and feedback. And what this framework is about is to help organizations to, understand their current state of maturity in the grand scheme of things. And as I said earlier, there are going to be a lot of different aspects that organizations in the cloud security journey need to pay attention to. So we actually help to group things into 8 different domains. Each of the domain have multiple different capabilities and so on, but we group things into 8 so that it's a little bit easier to organize and a little bit easier to manage. And then just like any other maturity framework and so on, we have 5 maturity states in each of the capability, where we use the CMMI type of lingo. And just to help you, understand is initial, manage, defined, quantitatively manage, and optimizing. Well, basically you can see it as 1 to 5, right? And with all that stuff that we have worked on, by the way, we spent quite a bit of time. I'm really proud to be able to share this with all of you. We have actually put all this information into a poster format. Yeah, a lot of you know that SANS is great at sharing, a lot of the material. And one thing that we do good at is sharing things as poster. So, this is a good resource to help you. Right now is in digital format today. And I do know that this poster is being printed and will be shared amongst the SANS event and so on. But this is what the poster looks like. As you can tell, there's a lot of details that are going to be here. And by the way, we're going to, within this session, we're going to be sharing some of the details, the highlight of the maturity state with you, so that you understand our thought process to get to how we consolidate that into 8 different domains and what does it actually represent, right? Like maybe you can through this session understand a little bit and refer back to the poster to gauge your own maturity in your own organization. That's really the hope here. And like I said, we intend to keep this up to date so that over time we'll reflect on the best practices that generally changes every year or so. So that's really the intention, and all the excitement is about sharing this with you today. And I know earlier it was more of an eye chart. Nobody can see other than a lot of different text and small fonts in the diagram. We're going to dissect into or drill down or double click into each of these areas. But these are the security domains, the 8 of them, like the security governance, infrastructure, architecture and protection, data protection, security assurance, detection and response, application workload protection, IAM, and workforce transformation. Before we dive into each of them, like the highlight here is not what it is not about, is not that it's just about technical. Well, SANS traditionally, we offer a lot of courses in that deep technical knowledge, but we are also in the management curriculum as well. So we want to make sure that we balance the technology, the people, right? Like, for example, the workforce transformation, and also, the process, the technology, and the people as well, right? So, all 3 aspects, we have certain level of coverage to make sure that as an organization move forward with the cloud journey, and wherever you are at a current state, you have something to measure by, right? This helps as a reference guide and hopefully help some of the organizations that are planning for their future movement, future iterations of their cloud security program. This will help as a resource as well. With that, let's dive into some of the areas here. First thing up is security governance, and I'm going to pass it on to my partner, Lysandra, to walk us through this particular area about what we're thinking about and what some of the measurement looks like.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. So one of the first domains that we have identified that you can find on the poster is the cloud security governance. And before I start diving into the areas or the capabilities that Jason just mentioned, I just want to go back to one of the reasons why organizations often move to the cloud. They move to the cloud because they want to go faster. They want to either go faster, deploy something faster, or they want to have a faster time to market. And because of you're deploying something faster and trying to do something faster, you also have a higher risk of something failing. This is where having a cloud security governance like a blueprint can help you lower the risk that something will fail by having a blueprint to model against, to continue having the same outcome every time you deploy something to the cloud. So now let's start looking at the three areas that we have highlighted on the slide: cost management, security policy, cloud governance committee. We will start with cost management. And like Jason said, we will be looking at the maturity. And if you think about cost management, this is something, especially in the beginning, you might have organizations that have different departments that have started using cloud technology. They don't know about each other, but each one is using a cloud technology and even doing their own cost management. This is not necessarily bad. This is just a maturity state. This would be your initial state. As you're getting more departments start using cloud, you want to be able to align the business department and get to a cost management framework and a cost management policy. The ideal one would be the optimizing state. In this state, you would be looking to make sure that your business goals align with your cost management. You will also want to make sure that the actual spend is also what you have budgeted. Now let's take a look at security policy. So for security policy, again, we can go back to the initial state. You have a few departments that have some clouds that are using some cloud security functionality, but you still have the normal security policy, your old security policy. You haven't really adjusted it yet to include any of the cloud security items. This is okay. This is the initial state of the maturity. If you want to continue improving, you can start looking to adjust the security policy to include more specific cloud security items and look at the risks and look at compliance items. In the optimizing state, you want to be looking at making sure that this security policy is continuously updated, making sure that it complies with industry best practices, compliance, and also any new cloud security that you're continuously adopting, any new framework. So the next one that we have here is the Cloud Governance Committee. The Cloud Governance Committee, as we just talked, you have different departments that are using cloud. So you want to have those business executives at a table. So they would be the ones that would be discussing and making cloud decisions. And they're also in the best position to be able to identify any stakeholders, cross-functionals that might be able to join, that need to be part of this committee. In the optimizing state, you want to make sure that this is continuously being done. Continuously, you would be being double-checked if the membership if you have all the stakeholders at the table. And also, you want to have leadership to be able to provide feedback that will result in the direction that the Cloud Governance Committee will be taking. So this was really brief about security governance, and I know that that Jason mentioned it. We will be having other sessions where we will be going much more in depth about each one of the items. So if we can change the slide, Jason, thank you very much. So the next domain that we have is workforce readiness. And when moving to the cloud, often we say that the organization is moving the technology and leaving the employees on premise, meaning that they want to be using this new technology, but they're not really making sure that the employees or the people who need to work with this technology are able to work with it, giving them the proper training to do that. And that's also one of the reasons that often they're not getting the maximum benefit from the cloud technology that they're trying to use. And this is what this is what this maturity model, the capabilities that we have on screen right now, is trying to address: skill readiness and organizational alignment. So in skill readiness, like we had our initial state, we have a few departments. You want to make sure that the people that are working with it, the people that are actually using the cloud technology, that they are getting trained. That should be your initial state. Make sure that they have the right training to be able to support it. After that, you can go to more specific ones, and we will be looking at that in organizational alignment, because then you start looking at job functions and making sure that, for example, Jason mentions web application. So you want to make sure you can look for specific web application training and those type of training. And another thing you might want to be looking at a later stage is, even though not your complete IT team is working with cloud, provide them some cloud training, because that can really be beneficial for the communications between the teams. And not only that, they are able to see some opportunities for innovations within their own areas that they might be able to use cloud for. And in the optimizing state, we want to make sure that this is a continuous learning process. You can think about gamifying this by using gamifying certifications or training. In the organization alignment, that's okay. We can. So I just want to go briefly over organization alignment, and that's the part that you're going to be in the beginning. You won't have any specific cloud functions. So as we just discussed about skill readiness, where you will be looking for training specific for those job functions, you want to make sure that your organization, when you're in a later state, you're going to start creating roles, matrices that are more cloud specifics. Yeah, Jason, we can change the slide. Thank you. So data protection. And as we're moving data to the cloud, this is going to be the protecting of data is going to become more complex. And we will be going that, especially when we talk about data classification and protection. Because often when we say, as for security for us, it's very important to know where the data is. We cannot protect if we don't have any visibility. And I think that's where you start in this maturity model for data classification and protection. You need to be able to identify all those departments that are using cloud. Where are they storing the cloud? What kind of services they are using? That should be your initial state. You can do this throughout if you have something automated, or just doing this manually. Once you have that in place, once you have those identified, that's when you start looking at using some kind of automation to be able to identify sensitive data and be able to remediate that by putting encryption in place. In the optimizing state, that's where you want to be probably using some kind of API that's automatically able to look for sensitive data using some kind of regex or using logic to be able to detect sensitive data, and also remediating this, and also looking for any cloud malware that might be there. And I just want to touch data backup resiliency, and that's because often when people move things to the cloud, they think that at that point, now business continuity is no longer my problem. Disaster recovery is no longer my problem. But actually, you need to make sure that at this point, initial state, when you're moving something to the cloud, make sure you still have a disaster recovery and a business continuity plan in place. What are the requirements now that you have moved to the cloud? And with that, Jason, I'm handing it back over to you for the next one. Thank you.
Great. That definitely came from a lot of experience, and now it's my turn. And yeah, we'll definitely talk about this particular domain, which is the infrastructure architecture and protection. Arguably, if you came from a technical background, like this is it, right? This is the universe of the technical domain. This is not all of it, obviously. Like you have multiple different areas, like for example, cascading some of those technical skills into encryption as well. But this represents a big chunk of how you design your cloud environment, and also, what sort of technology do you use to protect your cloud, corner of the cloud environment that your cloud service provider has given to you, right? Or you bought that, or you rent that from the cloud service provider. Now, there are 5 different areas here. The first one on the left-hand side, definitely highlight that one to you to focus on. Because if there are 2 things that I can spend my time on in cloud, I would definitely choose to focus a lot on configuration management. The other one being IAM, which is another domain coming up, right? So configuration management is really important, because if you think about it in cloud, everything is infrastructure as code, everything is configuration. the last tally that I looked at was like, hey, across all three major cloud service provider, there are 200,000 different configuration items that you can select. One wrong move, you know what's going to happen, right? So managing the configuration is super crucial. Organizations not only need to come up with the right configuration template to start off with, again, coinciding with our themes of zero to hero, you would want to start off with, doing the best you can at the initial stage. Later on in the journey, you actually get into how do we automate those things, right? Like after we decide on what the configuration template looks like, then roll it into some of your automated workflow in order to make things, as soon as you provision for it, as soon as you deploy it, it's already secure by default. So that's some of the mature state there, right? And image management, moving on to the right-hand side, image management is another aspect. This is, arguably a little bit more legacy-like, because, hey, some of the speed daemon or some of the more, advanced cloud model are going into serverless and so on. So OS image becomes the last portion of the security, portfolio. However, most of the organization these days still maintain, either virtual machine or your containers has images as well that are related to the operating system. So, over here, the journey again is, hey, do the best you can, use whatever you currently have, at the starting point. Those virtual machine container images are probably okay. But over time, build the pipeline and build a certain level of validation into the pipeline is really the maturity, that we're talking about here. And, the thing about the cloud is that things move at millisecond, microsecond, and at that scale. And you bring up the images and you bring it down. The scanning, for example, the traditional on-prem scanning that we do, it doesn't matter as much here, right? Like you're not going to catch some of the security issues just by doing the regular, runtime scanning, throw some of your vulnerability scan at it. It doesn't really work like that. So you got to cut the problem off at the supply chain, if you will, right? Like as you roll the images out, or as you build the images, you figure out whether there are vulnerabilities or old stuff in that image. So automating it makes a lot of sense. And moving on, I cannot emphasize on the cloud secure architecture. This is where most of the organization can really play into the design. Transformation happens over a lot of times over here, right? Because from a lot of the assumptions of the on-prem, environment and so on, we have gotten a lot of the assumptions right for many years. However, once you're in cloud with the shared responsibility model, then some of those assumptions need to change. And certainly some organizations do the change a lot quicker, but some of the organizations have tougher time. So this is, where, we measure whether the organizations are actually adopting the cloud, sensible, secure model. And we're talking about things like, hey, are you using the landing zone, sort of best practices and so on? That's really where the architecture, and component comes in. And your architecture needs to come back with certain templates that rolls back into your automation across the board, right? And I would say that, next up is really the resource management. That ties back into some of your configuration management. The question is like, hey, are you tagging your resources properly? Because if you don't tag, right, you are going to have hundreds of thousands of different resources that you cannot manage, right? Like, you pick up a resource, you're like, what is this? And I've seen that in a lot of organizations there as well. So the maturity state is, how are you managing your resources? Are you really using the best practices towards your infrastructure as code, like your IAC components? The last piece over here within this big chunk is really about the network controls. Well, in the cloud environment, you're still managing your network, right? Like even though it's virtual, and there are certain considerations that you need to provision for that, right? Like for example, how do you manage your internal and external IP addresses, right? Like, some organization will say, nah, we've done this for many, many years, right? Like we've started managing a network since 20 years ago. Well, but then, 20 years ago, you didn't rent IP address, on a on a per instance basis. So some of those assumptions really, or some of those operating model within cloud security provider, within cloud service provider really changes the dynamics there. So management of the IP address alone is a big deal. And then there are certain other, provisioning like, hey, how is your geolocation within, your network setup? And also, how do your workforce actually connect back into your cloud environment? Are you using SASE? Are you using, some of those, zero trust type of model? Those becomes your network configuration, maturity state consideration as well. And obviously, as I talk about most of these things, the details are inside that poster, the eye chart that we're talking about earlier. So while I go through these pretty quick, you should be able to reference to that poster that I was referencing earlier. Earlier I mentioned like, hey, if there are two things that I can manage out of cloud, I would definitely spend a lot of time in the IAM area. This is the identity and access management area. And the identity, I think a lot of people get it, right? Like, hey, is how do you actually, manage your user, and what sort of how do you actually authenticate a user? And, for example, are you using some of the MFA? How do you identify the users, right? And how do you actually ensure that the users are the right ones that actually, talk to your environment? And then, by the way, in cloud environment, that's not just users. There is also machine-to-machine type of conversation as well. There are a lot that goes on in here. And while they're only free, I can tell you right now, like, there are a lot of content within each of these areas. The identity management is big, right? Because, generally, also organizations don't generally have one cloud. How do you integrate all your cloud environment and possibly your on-prem as well? There are going to be certain level of authentication, federation, and so on that needs to go here. So the question of that transitioning phases of maturity is how integrated are you across your organization? For example, JSON LAM, is it just one identity across the board? Is JSON LAM using MFA to authenticate in? How do you tie that single identity across all the resources, and so on? So that's really the identity management. It's segregation. While the name is like, hey, this is an odd one. Think about how do you actually break down your complex structure around? The question is, hey, you may have different hierarchy in your organization. You may have different projects across your organization. What does that structure looks like? All the cloud services provider, namely your Azure, your AWS, your GCP, they provide a lot of capabilities for you to break it down, right? There are many different structures that you can go after. And they have certain level of guidelines and recommendation, but ultimately it's up to your organization to say, yep, every real project actually, for example, if you're in GCP, it's actually going to be a project. Well, that's the decision that your organization need to make and enforce that consistently, right? So that it becomes, sort of the, consistent factor across your organization, regardless of which part of the organization you're in. And that's that, right? This, while seemingly, hey, this is pretty basic, that political, journey to make sure that everybody is on the same page with agreement, the consensus and so on, makes this task somewhat contentious in a lot of organizations that I've talked to. Then another factor over here, right, that we measure about the maturity is about access management. Just like configuration, access management is big area. There are hundreds of thousands. I think I look at, for example, AWS has, this storage service S3. If I look at it, I think it is that one single service has 135, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, different permission that you can set. And generally organizations would adopt many different cloud services. So, the multiplier effect, right, makes it really, really, really big that if you mess up one single, access control factor, then, the rest is history, right? So that's not exactly easy. You got to go back into, benchmarking with your CSP. They have certain guidelines and recommendation. You may be able to start adopting some of that stuff, that are prepared for you at the early stages of maturity, and then moving on to customizing it so you can further lock it down. The other aspects in this area is, how does your administrator, get permission to do their job, right? If I'm a threat actor, I get into your environment, guess what? I'm going to figure out how to escalate privileges, right? Like escalate, jump, hop around. And that is what most threat actors would do. What that means is that you need to figure out, in your environment, how do you actually use some of these features that your cloud service provider provided you, like just-in-time permission, temporary access management. So, through the maturity journey, start rolling in some of these, ingredient into securing and layer on your defenses so that, your access management is much more strengthened. And I would also add one last bullet point here. A lot of these activities are very early on of the journey because you cannot afford to do it too late. That's what it comes down to. With that, let's move on to the next area, which is security assurance. Well, security assurance really is about, organizations, every organizations, at the leadership level will say, we want to be great, right? We want to be, very good, maturity state need to be at least 4. But the question is, hey, how do you know that you are there? And how do you know that you're adhering to the benchmark? And how do you know that you don't have any vulnerabilities, right, associated with your cloud environment? And if vulnerabilities or gaps are found, like, does it get fixed, right? Identifying it as one thing, getting it fixed is the other. So some of the posture validation, we also roll into the maturity model, some of the stakeholders engagement, and also stakeholders identification, particularly in organizations that span over thousands of people in IT organization. That can become a little bit difficult, right? Like getting to identify each of the organization that are responsible to fix each type of flaws that you could find are not exactly easy. So identifying those at a very early on stage of your maturity model is really important. That's in addition to your technology span to actually automatically detect, find the benchmark, implement the benchmark automatically, and recurringly assess your environment. That's really the posture validation there, right? So it's actually quite a big item there. And you would find that highly regulated environment, like some of the things that, in my day job, certainly does invest a lot in this particular area. Then you also have regulatory compliance that, again, tie back into posture validation, but it's about validating, the benchmark that is set by your regulator. And a lot of times, the CSP, your cloud service provider, helps you with it. And they create these templates to make it easier for you to use so that you don't have to go one by one and read the regulation, work with your legal team, and then, getting the technical aspects. A lot of these pre-work have been done for you. But due to your own organization's needs, sometimes you have to actually also alter that or customize that a little bit as well. And there's also the aspects of, in the assurance world, capturing some of your audit details as well over time. That would help you a lot. So that's, some of the journey in the regulatory compliance, particularly at the higher end, is all about tracking, your different audit responses and so on. That's really important. Then there is also security testing here. So your organization may do, certain level of penetration, vulnerability scanning, penetration testing early on. And, some people are surprised by the fact that, hey, penetration testing seems to be really good. Why is it early on? Well, the fact of the matter is that a lot of organizations just said, okay, we do go do a pen test. A really good pen test at a mature state, at a mature state would require the organization to come up with specific scenarios, right? Certain assumptions that requires a lot of different teams to get involved to actually craft out based on your threat model to come up with the right level of testing. And then at a later stage, the testing also transform into what we call some of the purple team exercises, some of the red blue team type of hey, attackers are working on one side, defenders are like, hey, can you see it, and so on. That's really some of the attack simulation type of events. You already simulate, hey, I don't care so much about the outside, but also you simulate the attacker is already in. What can they do, right? So that's some of the mature state, particularly later on, on the security testing. So it's not just so much like find somebody, go test, and happy, right? It's also about fixing as well. Understanding your environment is not necessarily the simplistic task, but understanding it to craft the right test to validate your control is really the mature state here. Okay, then we have the detection and response. This is also another interesting area because all organizations, there are what, two types of organization. One that has been breached and the other one that didn't know that they were breached, right? So, at some point, you really, really, really need to lock down your detection and response capability. The good thing here is that your cloud service provider has done a lot of great work for you, right? However, there are still a lot of work that organizations need to do to mature their security model. So we're talking about like security intelligence that actually feed back into your monitoring scope. So, a lot of organizations like, I'm monitoring. What exactly are you monitoring, right? A lot of these monitoring scope, right? Like the TTP, the IOC that you monitor for, they come from your security intelligence. So building a pipeline there, right? Obviously, at the starting point, you take different feeds, industry feeds, and then at a more mature state, you actually get into your own research, based on your existing or your industry level, experience, and your own organization's expertise as well. That gets into the later on stage of the security intelligence that actually feed back into the second item over here, which is your analysis and monitoring. The analysis and monitoring is really about, how do you refine that? Obviously at start, everybody will, write some very simplistic logic to say, hey, if I see this thing 5 times, that's too much, sort of the rate-based sort of detection. But then over time, using your security intelligence, you can do a lot more here. And the question is, how can you quickly roll in those capabilities quickly based on your security intelligence? If those things are decoupled, then you're not running a mature organization in this particular area. So, and how do you handle the alerts and so on? That's what it comes down to, right? Like, there has to be a certain level of process that actually comes into play. Now, response in the traditional on-prem environment, right, is more like, okay, let's go and measure the response time. And I've certainly, driven that, spent quite a few years in that particular world a lot, right? In the cloud environment, the good and the bad is that there are a lot of automation capabilities. So you can actually, once you identify the areas that you want to automate, you have a lot of capabilities there. But the question is, can you build those playbook, right, manually, and then very quickly automate them? That's sort of your transition towards the mature state, starting to build a playbook, and then roll in, so that it becomes repeatable. Then it becomes, automated, with the right resources, paying attention to it. And you got to prioritize them, because otherwise, you're prioritizing the wrong thing. So you're still doing a lot of manual work, right? So that's the response, type of maturity. Log management is rather easy to understand, right? Like, hey, there are a lot of logs, do you want to roll in all your logs so that you can have one single pane of glass that you actually have, visibility across your entire environment, whether it's on-prem or in cloud. So that's that. And the journey obviously is, hey, collect the most logs into a centralized location. Application and workload over here. This one is easy to understand. Hey, your cloud environment are not just built to do nothing, right? Usually they are there to support certain level of workload that you run in your environment. And what that means is that, a lot of applications and so on get a new life, right? You refactor certain applications to get into the cloud. And where you can actually get a lot of benefit is that, for example, the cloud service provider has given you capabilities such as secrets management and some of these encryption advancements. Where these capabilities exist, do you actually take advantage of it? Because as you modernize into the cloud environment, building the cloud native applications, that's where you can actually adopt a lot of these features and make your workload way more secure, right? Like certain level of like CWPP, like workload protection systems. These are things that, in the on-prem world, things can be a little bit more tricky to run, but then it becomes a lot easier in the cloud world. So the journey here, particularly with the maturity model that we're talking about is 0, may not be adopting a lot because you're not really refactoring a lot of your application. But as soon as you do, at a later stage, you'll be able to roll in a lot of these capabilities to make your environment and your workload much stronger. Then, the middle part of it is the most obvious part, the SaaS and the DAST, right? Like, source code analysis and the dynamic analysis. These things generally haven't changed that much, from the traditional security model. However, one thing that we have seen a lot of organization changes is that, with the cloud pace, Lysandra earlier mentioned, right? Like things are moving very quick. So with the CI/CD pipeline getting automation, you have a lot of opportunity to roll in these scanning and assessment capabilities into your development pipeline. So that's where the workload assessment, how much automation you're doing can roll into your maturity. And then cloud application practices. This is really to measure, hey, how much are you really into this CI/CD pipeline that I was talking about? The more automated you are, the better it is. And one aspect of it that we measure is about how do you actually handle your credentials and stuff like that? Because as we know, right, like if you go to any conferences nowadays, the pen test conversation on cloud seems to be, I get into a little corner, I pivot using the credential that I have amassed, I've gathered, particularly in some of the CI/CD area, people accidentally drop a lot of credentials in there. So, how do you avoid some of those things by leveraging some of the DevSecOps capability, shifting left, validating as early as possible to avoid either the vulnerabilities in your code or accidentally dropping additional credentials in your application code is really the name of the game here, right? Like in the maturity model, just measure that, along the 5 phases. So that's that. And with that, we have gone through the 8 different areas, giving you the highlight of it. Again, most of these details are inside that poster. And we welcome any feedback. Hey, if you feel that, hey, there's this aspect, or hey, this one is a little bit too advanced for most of the folks, I would love to hear about that, right? And we vouch that we would keep the model updated as we receive feedback from all of you. And as I said, right, it's in the poster that we published so far. We also want to make a shameless plug here, right? Like the topics that we cover in the model itself, I actually taught by one of the course that I wrote, which is the Management 520 Leading Cloud Security Design and also Implementation. Check that course out if you get a chance. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions here to see if anybody has any questions.
Yes, Jason, I have the first question for you. How do I implement this model into my organization?
Great question. Well, today, webcast is more about the introduction of the model to everyone. Okay, we only went through the highlights of it. We will definitely, circle back and, have other sessions to talk about, some of the experiences that, we've seen at, how other organizations have adopted this, and share some of the experiences there. So more to come on that. Like today session, we won't have time. Otherwise, it will be an 8-hour webcast or something like that. So yes, great question on that. And we'll publish more and more information on that as we go along here. So thanks for the question.
Yes, the next question is, where can I get a copy of the cloud maturity model? And I just posted the link in the chat for everyone to be able to access.
Excellent. And I think I am flipping the slides over to the poster as well. Yeah, it's at the bottom of the slide. And I think, yeah, Laura, you just flip it over to chat as well. So either way, you should be able to get that link.
And I will tell everyone listening that this link is downloadable. You can download the poster at any time, and any updates that Jason and Lysandra will be making to it will be kept up to date on the digital copy. In 2023, we will have printed copies available, but only at certain conferences. So be on the lookout. Those are not things that we will be mailing out in the future, but available on site.
Is it a hint that people should go to the conferences?
I guess so, yes. And at this time, we don't have any other questions.
Oh, okay.
So we'll give it a second, see if anyone has anything else to add. Thank you so much for the presentation and bringing this content to the SANS community. To our audience, thank you very much for listening in and participating with us. Jason and Lysandra, thank you so much for your expertise and sharing your time with us. For a full schedule of upcoming SANS webcasts, please visit sans.org/webcasts. And until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you, everyone.